So we have Pauno Letto Vuori with us. You probably know him far better than I do, but it sounds really exciting. So thanks very much for coming. And yeah, you start when you're ready.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for suggesting that we are in the middle of triathlon. I also think it's quite a heavy program, and now after swimming with Hans, going in the depths of Rio and so forth, we can start cycling, I think. My talk is quite theoretical, but I hope it's not boring. I don't have so many examples. If you have time, I will tell a bit about some cases in Helsinki that the locals know, but that might be new. But let's see how the time goes. How much time I have? About 40 minutes, or?
40 minutes,
yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Good. Before, I just realized that Hans was showing these nice books and the whole history. So I realized that I didn't bring my books, and I somehow failed to introduce myself in that sense. But it's quite amazing. I mean, Charles Landry is coming on Saturday, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And I was involved with Jan Verwijnen, the late Jan Verwijnen, in actually introducing Charles Landry and Franco Bianchini to Helsinki. It happened in the mid-1990s, so it's more than 20 years ago. It's amazing. I mean, I really I'm feeling that I'm kind of, I should really go also to countryside and retire, maybe. But really, it was the process that was then preparing the Helsinki. Helsinki's cultural year as a European cultural capital in 2000, and Charles Landry came already in 1995. We had in Arabiaranta in University of Art and Design, now it's Aalto, quite an interesting workshop in 1995. There's a book called Managing Urban Change, produce of that, and then later we made a book called Creative Cities. I don't know, maybe you still can get those books from the Aalto bookstore, or maybe those are in internet nowadays. But the Creative City was 1999, and then of course 2000 there was the Year of Culture. I was making my PhD around that time, and I became quite interested in actually in the topic of today of experiential urbanism, the role of people in making change in cities. Basically, I think that's pretty much the topic of my talk. I think we can situate this discussion, temporary uses, all those initiatives Trevor brought in, tactical urbanism, everyday urbanism, catalyzing architecture, like Hans, many others, in broader picture, in the change from industrial to urban society. I think that's what I will try to do today. I realized when preparing this talk that it's work in progress, so I don't have this kind of ready-made big point. It's rather thoughts that are developing, but clearly I'm interested in change, in new ways to initiate change in cities, and in what role ephemerality, temporariness can have in that process, in this contemporary situation that is defined by Henri Lefebvre as urban society, by Christian Schmid as even a shift to urban continent, in this kind of sense of different processes that are shaping our society, our life, and our cities. Good. Some theoretical points. So clearly, of course, planning, be it Prut Igor, be it Tapiola, is changing. We are facing a paradigm change in planning, and this is a diagram I somehow made a long time ago, but I never had time to really qualify this. But it's quite funny observation that it's kind of key innovations in urban planning, urbanism, Ebenezer Howard Garden City, the formalization of modernity planning agenda in 1920s, 1930s by Thiam, and then its first major critiques by Lefebvre, of course, by Jacobs, by Jan Gehl, by many others, Venturi, etc., in late 60s and early 1970s. Those kind of moments of change happened same time with the big global economic recessions. And I don't know how to explain that, but somehow I think, that of course, there is the Asian notion that a crisis is a moment of rebirth. Might be that. It also might be that some people simply didn't have work and they had time to think. That also could be. I always imagine Elil Saarinen during this is the year of civil war in Finland, 1918. It's 100 years since civil war. I imagine Elil Saarinen with his team, with his wife and all the friends, sitting in Vitresk in this castle in the middle of the forest. The country is in the war. There is no work at all. And then during that winter, they did this fantastic plan about the Greater Helsinki vision, this fantastic watercolors and so forth. So there is something strange in that crisis and innovation. Anyway, clearly the so-called global financial crisis, 2007-2008, is very visible. This is the diagram showing the success of companies in London Stock Exchange. It's one way to try to understand the economic process. The so-called long cycles of Kondratiev and so forth. We can debate that point. But anyway, I think there is a question mark. Is there a innovation moment in planning, and if, what is the shape of that? And I think there is a lot of writing, for example, by Quentin Stevens and many others about the changed economic context, very short cycles of investment, need to get profit quickly, all these kind of things that at least lead a little bit towards the field of temporary, tactical, ephemeral interventions. These examples Hans brought are really great, and I was just you said that this Super Kielen, it was 100 million kronor, and then I saw that this elevator was 12 million US dollars. Actually, they are equal in price, quite exactly, in fact. But yeah, I don't know. Is it much or little? Of course, with 10 million, if you can make a big change, it's quite cost efficient compared to even one small building costs the same. Anyway, definitely there is something in this quickness in temporary urbanism and so forth. But a question mark. I don't think we have this kind of important one person, important one discourse that would define where we are. It's still pretty much open, and maybe even today, tomorrow, we can together get one step further. As said, it's a thought process. It's some proposals for our agenda during the lab, not a ready-made answer. I was just writing an article to one book by Routledge about this question of urban society, and I found this quote from Lefebvre, 1970, from them. No, forgot the book. It comes in a second. Anyway, he's asking that if this urban society kind of hypothesis of Lefebvre is true, he's asking that could it enable a development of new humanism? And he's asking, okay, if the industrial society, capitalist or not, of course that was time of Soviet Union and so forth, having effectively rejected its earlier form. So basically, he's asking, are we in a situation that something that is coming from people, from the users, from citizens, the whole debate about diversity, differential space, and so forth, could it be possible to realize that now in this new moment of urban society? And I think that's quite nice. Trevor also mentioned humanism as one of the key points of the debate here. So there is something interesting there. for Lefebvre, this notion of urban society, it was a hypothesis. It was kind of thought experiment. And he talks about critical phase, about some kind of moment of crisis which might open possibilities for new, and that's written in 1970, so it's, of course, historical writing. Critical phase that is foregrounding radical social change. And what is interesting is that for Lefebvre, it really was urban in the sense that it's place-bound. It is possibilities that are embedded in the complex urban situations, self-organizing processes, novelties, and so forth. And Lefebvre is discussing quite much the notion of habiting. I mean, we all know there's a big debate about networks and information, and Manuel Castells, Neil Brenner, Christian Schmidt, that was already mentioned. The whole debate about planetary urbanization, and that's also a notion from Lefebvre, actually. That's something I didn't have yet time to do, so I cannot present my critique of that. Maybe in the next Nordic Urban Lab, I would really like to shoot down this planetary urbanization, very, very misunderstood debate, especially failing to understand the importance of cities. And quite funnily, maybe some of you were listening yesterday, there was a quite large urban policy meeting in Helsinki organized by the mayor of Helsinki. It's called Helsinki Symposium. Of course, it's national fight between something. It's not so important for us. But there was one good point made in that big gathering of all mayors and policymakers and people like that, that cities are specific. It's in the field of urban studies, it's a perennial question. Can we talk about cities at all? Do cities exist? And of course they do exist on some level, but when you go to the theoretical debate, it starts from Louis Wirth, and there is a long debate about what is actually specific in cities, what is specific in the urban way of life, as Wirth and so forth. But clearly, again yesterday, it was made quite well the point that there is something special in cities that makes them, for example, interesting, that makes them economically successful, and also something that justifies different policy and planning for cities as compared to the rest. And clearly it's not a point against the rest. I'm living in countryside. We are having 2 horses and old farmhouse and stuff like that. It's great. But I also like cities. Both are good. But there is definitely something unique in cities. And that's a point that is not easy to grasp. It's important, not easy to grasp. And clearly these Lefebvrean points about habiting, different space, resources coming together in unique constellations, making something new, innovation, novelties possible. There is something important which should be again restated and re-theorized in the contemporary situation, in the situation where we are right now with all these things we know: global mobile phones, a new agency, artificial intelligence, all that. There is a very, very, I would say, fantastic and interesting field of both theory and practice in front of us. It's a great time for new kind of planning, and I try to discuss that under this notion of experiential urbanism. It's just a title in a way, but anyway, good. Lefebvre did not substantiate his ideas actually too much. His texts are kind of asset, hypothesis, suggestions. He's much more focusing on the epistemological difficulty to see through the singularity. I mean, Stephen Hawking died just now. He was talking about singularity. Can we see through singularity? And you remember even the Pope was interested in that, because Pope thought that if there's singularity, you can see through the singularity, the God is behind that. And then Hawking, with his famous Hawking radiation of the black hole, he somehow was questioning that maybe actually you can see through singularity, and that's why Pope was so interested in Stephen Hawking. But anyway, that's also for Lefebvre the question that can we actually see through the systemic change? I mean, industrial society, the 150 years of all that is changing. Something new is coming, and we don't know what. And it's a deep philosophical question. He's talking about blind field, that we're kind of blinded. We don't see through. We cannot actually talk about the new. We cannot put that in actual written knowledge. We don't know, and that's true. But I think as architects, as planners, as urbanists, we have the great possibility to experiment. It's of course a bit. It's not really strong point philosophically, but it's a good point in practice that through all kind of experiments, people-based, actor-based, social innovations, spatial innovations, we can actually create the future. We can test what works. We can test what is liked by people, what is helping marginalized communities, as in Hans' examples, what is making new kind of social constellations possible and sustainable in different cities and so forth. It's very much a field of experimentation, and that is one explanation why this dimension of temporariness, ephemerality, temporary use is important, and maybe even, I would say, structurally significant notion in the contemporary situation. Clearly, there are these points about Lefebvre, this double illusion, and so forth. In a way, that the false idea that space can be designed in this moralistic sense, all that we should focus much more on really people being open to new things, to novelties, and not so much in them somehow in the way how to control, how to make it visible and so forth. So it's quite a big change in them in the way how our field, how architecture planning operates. What are our tools? What is the central focus of our activity? Many things should be changed in that. Clearly, after Lefebvre, it's quite easy even to take the position that urban reality, it's not transparent. There are surprises. All these things we know. Space is complex. It's a process. It's also a humus. It's kind of ground. I really like the Palestinians bringing the ground from Palestine to Copenhagen. So yeah, I was expecting what are the plants that start to grow from that ground. It's an interesting question, but it's also very Lefebvrean question. And one way to approach this question: what is this habiting in Lefebvrean sense? What is the practice? What are the activities that make something new possible? Is to focus on the quite small, everyday events, tiny details of spatial practice, even gestures, how people behave, how they dress, graffiti, all those kind of things. Walking, you all know the famous essay by Michel Desserteau on the importance of walking, which route you take, all that, even decay, things getting old, all those are processes that all the time partake in production of space and production of public space, also more concretely in cities. And we should not forget those seemingly small, but in the end, very, very central things. Godiner saw this Lefebvrean process through Giddenscian lens and proposed that we have this process of big structures, institutions like planning, for example, then agency, like the agency of capitalist real estate developer to do something, and then the final urban pattern, the kind of city as we have it. But then, very importantly, Michel Desserteau makes this point that there is also this tactical position, weak players in the game, for example, individual citizens, small cultural organizations, activists, can also have a role. They can misread them, the structures created by the powerful, and they can do something new. So there is, I think, in this diagram, that is in this, I'm sorry, very simplistic picture, there is clearly the storyline of them big players, but also there is room for weak actors, and I think novelty is very much coming from successful combinations, successful successful niche innovations by quite often the weak actors. Okay, this was very condensed theory, and then some points about temporary uses. This is quite much based on some articles we have been co-writing with Sampo Ruoppila. There is one published by fantastic forum, the Serbian Architectural Journal in 2012, and then there is now quite a new book by Wiley, Transience and Permanence, edited by John Henneberry. That's quite a good book, so I recommend to read. It came last year out by Wiley. So we have been working with Sampo and trying to get an overview of the field of temporary uses and also trying to get some theoretical rigor asset. I don't feel that I fully succeed in that. But anyway, so here is just one reminder from quite early work by Urban Catalysts. So there was a very interesting EU project also about 20 years ago already called Urban Catalysts. Maybe it's a bit linked. Did you take part, Hans, in this Urban Catalysts? Yeah, yes, yes. It was not in Denmark, it was Berlin, of course. There was the Dutch group, there was Naples from Italy, Helsinki, and then it was Aalborg. Really? Okay, so there was something. Okay. Of course, Berlin became known as the capital of temporary uses then in late 1990s and early 2000s with all the moving clubs and all those things, Tempo de Rome, etc. But basically, this list is coming from that early work, and just it's good because it shows how rich also this field can be. So there are really many temporalities, and those very different temporalities do play a role in what actually what role in this change, what role of finding something new in the urban society can be. Clearly, the idea of impulse or a catalyst is important. With something rather small, you show a new opportunity, and then maybe other actors join. I think that's quite clear. A pioneer as well. The first urban use of an empty, derelict site. We can imagine all those industrial sites and so forth. But then also, I think very, very important point is the idea of migration. That, okay, you do something somewhere, you learn something, and then you can shift that to other site with other people and maybe do something similar but a little bit different. It almost could be linked to them kind of very seasoned so-called typological process by Saverio Muratori, Aldo Rossi, and others. It tells about what kind of change happens on one site, how one building that in some sense stays the same, but over decades, over centuries, and so forth, through small modifications, it actually becomes new. And with this migration, I think something similar happens in different way. Certain practice takes a different shape in different place. I think there is, it could be nice to, okay, other article that should be written. Anyway, clearly in this debate about temporary uses, there are many benefits recognized by them, cultural, social, new constellations, somebody finding somebody, and so forth. Some economic benefits, clearly it's linked to ecology as well. Adaptive reuse is often more resource efficient than some other form of change. And it also can have a positive role in planning management. We can come back to later. Dimensions of public benefit, clearly in the field of culture, the main topic of today. But there is the economic dimension through innovations. It's a bit hard to give an example, but I think the Paris plage, the idea that during the vacation period in summer, the highways on the river of the big metropolis, Paris, are closed, and there's a sand beach on that highway. It's of course very symbolic, and the situation is sandy beach and all that. So it's interesting, almost artistic thing, but clearly it's also an innovation. I mean, why not? And became a model that was then transferred to really many other places. There is quite much writing about urban beaches and so forth. What different roles? So it's some kind of innovation, spatial and a social or practice type of innovation that creates also new locations that may lead to actual real innovations. I think there is something about this Jane Jacobs and how something new is invented in cities. It's an example that it was possible to innovate a new kind of space, a new kind of practice, a new atmosphere, and in that sense, I think it qualifies as something interesting, definitely. Good. With Sampo, we have been trying to find you could call it a new typology of temporary uses, and we have been working with different type of location. So in metropolitan cores, like the Paris example, it's now in the picture actually. Temporary uses can intensify use. You cannot do much. You can imagine Paris or even the center of Helsinki. It's protected. It's already quite dense, high real estate values, all these kind of things. But temporary use can intensify. There is this outdoor swimming pool now in Helsinki called Allas Pool. It's one example. With temporary thing, you can do something which intensifies the use. Instead of just boarding boat, there are actually tourists in the sea. It's intensifying the use. Temporary. In these underused areas, often industrial, it can initiate something new. It's part of urban growth and change in that sense. And then in shrinking and declining cities and sites, which is a quite big question as well. We should not forget that not every city is growing. Very, very many places are actually shrinking. East Germany, northern Finland and Sweden, big parts of Russia, many marginal areas in almost any country, even in China. It's actually a big question, this shrinkage. Temporary uses can let's say, redefine the space and community. Temporary uses can give hope. They can, in some sense, give civic pride and show that life can be good even in the shrinking situation. So there is a lot interesting in those three locations, which creates some kind of element in the typology of temporary uses. Clearly, I think we can say that temporary uses, and that's the point, for example, Bishop and Williams, there is the book Temporary City, it's strange to name actually for the book, which collects very many of these themes. Peter Bishop, Leslie Williams, they make the point that temporary uses are actually a permanent element of contemporary cities. So it's not something that will go away, but no, it's all the time with us in some sense. And it's an important element, not an ephemeral curiosity of contemporary cities. And somehow, in this sense of theory, we can say that they're not too well theorized at the moment. There is this economic perspective, as mentioned, and then there is the political perspective, right to the city. Temporary use is understood as empowering possibility, or I don't like the word tool so much, but something like that. You get the point. Temporary use is looked from the developer and planner point of view, and temporary use is looked from the activist, interested citizen point of view. And those two are the theory lines, but those two discussions do not really meet. Actually, they are separate. Lauren Andres tries to link. There's quite a good paper about one case in Marseille and one case in Lausanne. What actually happens? How the temporary moment, how temporary use actually can influence over long term. I think that's one of the questions by Trevor as well. if you do some kind of cultural thing, what influence it has in the end, in the long run, in the big decisions, in the development, and so forth. Andres is discussing that. But these two lines, I said, do not meet, and we try to a little bit do that, try to find a different way to theorize. How really temporary uses can be understood as important element in creating novel urban environments. The question in this situation of weakened public planning and maybe even predatory capitalization of urban space and practices. So there is a tension, of course. Good. Instrument tools or valuable spaces, and we somehow thought that in finding a bit fresh theory in this situation of urban society, we could start from the point that it's about appropriation, it's about somebody taking a stake and having an active role in city, appropriating urban space. It is about creating value, but not only economic. It is about creating, for example, communal, social value for a group, and so forth. And then it's some form of conscious production of space, production of differential space, new social and spatial opportunities, including, of course, then the experiential dimension, different experiences. I think it's quite important that this whole debate in the end also leads to a different kind of city in the sense of how we feel about it. Good. This right to the city debate is a big debate in itself. I don't go in any depth in it. There are many writers active in it, but I think Harvey in the Rebel City, it's quite a nice book. He makes a good point that the right to the city, it's not only the right to be there. It's not only the right to have access to urban amenities, but it's really the right to reinvent the city. That's kind of Harvey's rereading of Lefebvre 40 years after Lefebvre, and I think that's quite interesting. And it, of course, links our debate very much to planning, to policy, to democracy, to possibility to partake in them, in the shaping of our let's say living conditions or life world. Good. So I just show again this appropriation, creation of value, production of space, and then as I said, in this thought process, we try to find some concepts that could help us to understand different aspects of temporary uses as structural element of contemporary urbanism. And these margins, it came in Hans' presentation very, very clearly. Yeah, I even referred to actually Hans. I had possibility to read the fantastic book on Roskilde Festival, and there is this point that really during the week when the event takes place, the social manners and the limiting norms, moralizing authority is put aside, and it's simply a moment of festival, and I think that's very, very important, and this only can happen in socio-spatial margin. You cannot have the festival. Okay, the Paris Plage is then an example, but there are nice stories how people behave in the Paris Plage, and you can imagine all the French people dressed even much better than me with nice polished shoes, and then they go to the beach, and it's what happens. So, but anyway, margins in the sense of Rob Shields saying that margins are culturally central. Shields is discussing Niagara Falls, the role of this kind of touristic and in special sense marginal locations. For example, for the marriage festivities of people and so forth. So margins are culturally central, and something very important happens in margins temporarily. Then the notion of follow, that's from different contexts completely. It comes from Franz Oswald and Peter Bacchini. There is a quite well-read book by planners called Netzstadt. It's written in German, but exists also in English. And they say that these empty and underused spaces geographically are also all the time present. It's of course true. Cities change, and there's always some location somewhere that are not defined. They are underused and undefined, and there are the urban fallows. They make something new possible, and it's interesting notion that in some sense brings this bit social and not rooted discussion to land and to even to maps, if you want to see it like that. Then we can discuss temporary uses as amenities, as something like library and school, maybe local shop. These are amenities, and we propose with Sampo that the difference, the novelty, the new kind of atmosphere, new kind of possibilities temporary uses provide, they actually should or could be seen as amenities that could be seen as a necessary, important part of any urban context, any urban situation. We all can imagine, for example, I remember myself working in Berlin some time ago. Our son was younger, and he still wanted to play. In Berlin, there were these squatted playgrounds in empty lots, and it was fantastic. Instead of just a boring street, a shop, and then an organized play area, there was this wild zone, and it was fantastic. It definitely was an amenity, and again, it only can exist temporarily. It's people-driven, self-organized, temporary, but can move to other places. So it's some kind of public good, even to all citizens. You could say. And then there is a very big discussion about urban commons. That's very interesting, and it's other issue that should be developed much further. But we have this distinction between public and private. We all know. I mean, public land, public space, and then rather stupid discussion on semi-private and semi-public and all that. It's not leading anywhere. But commons is a notion that actually could help us to find new opportunities. And it again, Harvey has been discussing that. There is quite a nice article by Hess mapping all kind of commons. There are, of course, hundreds if you want to list it, starting from Wikipedia and coming down to shared land and so forth. But basically, Hess is saying that common is a resource that is shared by a group where a resource is vulnerable. It's somehow there is not enough of that, and unlike public good, it requires some management and some protection to sustain. I think it's quite interesting. So we often tend to think that, for example, in Nordic cities that are not that dense, I think it's quite interesting to think that good public space, it's not scarcity in some sense. We have space, and then the more we use, the better it gets. It's not if we go to Hong Kong, it's not like that. It's too congested. But in our context, it's definitely the more people use, the better. It's more about contacts. You are meeting more people. It's more interesting all that. And in that sense, it's actually users who produce the value. Users create the value, and the question is that how we should react to that as planners and policymakers. One point is that, and that's Harvey's point, that it's wrong that the real estate owners get the value, because the more there is people, the more there is flow, the more there's also economic potential, and real estate values go up. So basically people should get at least part of that economic value they produce through their presence in a way. And I think that's quite interesting point to policy regarding commons, but also, and again referring to the previous presentation and this superkielen, there is also some need to in some sense protect or organize those processes case by case, and there is a quite differential role to planning policy compared to what were used in the previous industrial situation. How to softly curate, maybe how to make it a little bit better, how to manage so that some non-wanted things are not there, and so forth. So, commons, they are created by the group, but they need some protection. Good. Those are the four ways we try to discuss that field. Margins follows amenities and commons, and clearly we want to argue that a specific, as said earlier, place-based relation in the complex and self-organizing urban process, that's the key to uniqueness, to novelty, to difference, and that's what makes temporary uses interesting, that makes them work in the current situation. Good. Experimental, they lead to spatial social innovations. They facilitate new actors to come to the fore, groups that otherwise would be invisible in the city, and they may be consciously political alternatives for a new society. They do require some safeguarding, as said, some policy, and some criteria for a possible policymaker on that field might be those three: uniqueness of the play, the value could be also social, etc., value of the action, and then the difference itself. If it's all the same, it may be less interesting than really different. But this is also, I'm not quite sure how important this is, but some possible criteria, and then clearly showing them the differences in the kind of isotopy, everything is about money, of the capitalist state. They might be discussed as heterotopias, and they might represent the future of our cities in making. That's, in short, the theory. I think my time is out, pretty much. So I thought that I could discuss these Helsinki cases, but maybe just one. There's one story, but one. No. It's actually. I just. This is something. One slide is enough. What do you want to do? That's here. It's Oranssi. It's a organization in Helsinki that started in early 1990s as a squatting organization, but then quite quickly they started to act differently, and they started to negotiate with the city. They got old buildings and started to repair themselves for cheap youth housing. So they created cheap housing. They created new opportunities. It was a learning process. It was self-managed and cheap. So it became a alternative, quite interesting model for youth housing, and they still operate like that. So it became very sustainable model. It's now, I think, 30 years or so. Can it be true? Quite long. But then also they started to organize, again, temporary cultural centers. So it was this group of active youth and doing some things. So they also got cultural centers for a short time, a old shopping mall that was soon to be demolished or stuff like that. And then we were involved in many ways with Orange's activities during these decades in our architectural office. But then around 2011, after the horrible story about these railway warehouses here basically where very interesting cultural space, self-organized space, was in the end destroyed by real estate process in Helsinki. It was such a wound in the city that the city gave other industrial space, Suvilahti, to temporary users. They wanted to heal a little bit. And this Oranssi group got the last building in that new area, Suvilahti, as their next cultural space, and then we acted as curator of that process. And I think it's in our discussion today, it's important to realize that in every city, in every location, this, let's say, the field or the scene of temporary uses, of new experiential opportunities, it also has long histories. And in this case, there is the whole Helsinki planning tradition, starting I don't know when, but then also this big conflict around late 90s, early 2000s, 20 years ago, conflict that led a mark in the memory of the community of Helsinki, and then led to a bit surprising decision by the city to give this space for temporary cultural users, self-managed in a certain way. We could discuss at length how, and then how this migrating temporary use of the self-organized cultural center of youth is then located in this one, and how that was done. So there is interesting story. It looks quite nice. I mean, here is the head working himself, graffiti, and so forth. Good. I stop here. Sorry. I stop here, and maybe we have time for a question or two. Thanks.
Yes, Maunu?
Okay. I'm Maunu Häyrynen from the University of Turku. Thanks for a very inspiring presentation, Panu. I would like to ask about how do you see the connection between cultural planning and the temporary uses of space, how much they can be integrated into a planning process in your view, or how manageable you see they would be?
Yes, I was thinking this notion of cultural planning, and clearly they are part of same field and same discussion. We did some years ago a project with Sipoo. It's a municipality next to Helsinki, a quite rural municipality, and there is an old mental asylum, very large complex, huge hospital that is partly in new uses in housing, but then all the central buildings, fantastic Jugendstil buildings, are empty. And they wanted to do a cultural planning project to do something with that. And they brought some Swedish people, and the kind of concept of cultural planning rewritten by somebody at that time, some years ago, 2000, maybe 15, was it? Yeah, I think so, or 16, yeah, 2015. You can Google our website with Nikkilä if somebody wants to see the project is there, or in Sipoo. But anyway, they wanted this cultural approach, and then we did it. We did mapping of cultural resources, a little bit Charles Landry style, of course, in the built environment, in the memory of the mental asylum, of some very interesting cultural products of the mentally ill. Very many key poets and painters of Finland actually stayed there. It's not well written story. So there is a big cloud of cultural resources. I don't know if it's that right word anymore, but it was the right word in the 1990s. And then, so it was interesting, and it did work in many ways. We found resources for cultural planning because the normal planning did not work. They could not put these buildings in use with normal planning and real estate process. That was the starting point. And then, obviously, we proposed quite many temporary interventions, how to actually make the cultural resources concretely happen. So what could happen? Because of these reasons I tried to explain. It's temporary projects are easier to do and clearly one good option. So in that sense, I think there is definitely a link. And as I try to argue, if you look at other way around, clearly these differential spaces, new kind of locations and atmospheres, they are a cultural resource in themselves in the city.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, Leah. Yes.
Just briefly, I don't want to take too much time, but it's a lot of reflections from your presentation. There is almost a sense of romanticism around temporary interventions. I do understand that temporary interventions break the rules, break the norm, and bring a lot of experimentation and energy in a city or neighborhood or within a community. My problem, however, is how much do I let this happen? Where is the learning from these experiences going into? How is it fed into the bloodstream of the city?
Yes.
Are we feeding that into a vision for how the city wants to change ultimately? Or are we just doing them in a sort of postmodern, fun way because it's entertaining and because it gives something to the participants too? It empowers them too. But then again, if we leave them out there because we haven't got funding to continue this, or if it's not part of a whole vision for the city, then demoralization sets in.
Yes.
So I have I'm thinking. It's not a criticism or anything. It's just like thinking.
Yeah, thanks for the question. This is important question, and I'm quite aware that that also, I mean, myself and these kind of presentations, actually, I do objectify my topic, unfortunately, and I'm aware I'm not yet able to. Maybe the video is a way, or I don't know how to avoid that. But clearly, you're right. There is maybe a little bit misled romanticism on that way to discuss about temporary uses, and as I said, also question of objectifying, not looking the real actors, the real process, their actual difficulties, and so forth. But one question is that if somebody really has will to do something different, and I think the case of Oranssi, this self-organized cultural center, is in that. I think it's fine. There are young people, a group who is getting new members, interest. They have needs, and they can realize their needs in a way that could not happen in any other way. What is then needed from them, in that case, city, who is then the regulator, is some kind of understanding that this activity should have continuity in the next location. So it needs a little bit understanding and responsibility, so that when the location A is closed, there is location B in the way. Yes, they need some support in that sense, which can be quite lightweight. And then what is the bigger picture? In my opinion, it is linked to how we understand good city life and good urban policy as kind of sub-chapter of that, so that there is a real valuation of these novel spaces and practices. And you're right, it's horrible if it's a decoration. It should be taken seriously. It is a serious part of urban process and urban life.
It's not horrible, it's tactical urbanism, which I'm very much in favor of.
Yes.
But at the same time, I cannot ignore that we also need a strategic urbanism.
Yes.
We need some kind of sense of direction
Yes.
from whoever is in charge of
Yes.
governing the city.
Yes.
Now, whether tactical urbanism brings new stakeholders into the governance of
Yes.
the city is ideal, and then we may are in a different scenario, etc. But yeah, in my view, we should need to connect the strategic
You mean
element,
both? Yes. But then I think
strategic element
that's-
to the tactical.
Yes, that's a good question, because Helsinki copied the idea to actually use temporary uses as a tool in the strategic development. That idea was copied from somewhere. Maybe I can't now recall who actually invented it first, but anyway, it came to Helsinki in early 2000s, about 10 years ago, And instead of just putting a plan and starting to build in some new areas in Kalasatama, in Kruunuvuorenranta, which are large new developments, really big, definitely defining the shape of Helsinki in the future. They wanted to start with temporary uses, and they put in a very nice program with some funds from the city, a curator, open process, everything. It seemed great. Yeah, now it's happening, and temporary users are invited, and then. But what happened is that some in the city did not like what happened. It was too creative, or it was wrong, and they stopped it just like that. Bam, and then. 1 or 2, that's the case of Kalasatama. 1 or 2 years after the 2 years that the funding was there, these actors still did something, but without money. And then city started to just organize big events. Just they invite some Peter Gabriel to sing or something like that. And they thought that they put the same money in Peter Gabriel and big concert. And that was quite wrong. So it's not easy to really do. I think that's what you mean, that the city did not trust its own process in the sense of actually doing something new. They wanted to anyway do the same, and then when something new started to happen, they just cut the funds and let those people. So it is not easy, and definitely we are dealing with heavy processes, with big organizations and so forth. And in Tampere, there is a little bit different process on the way. Right now, Tampere is second city, so it's smaller context than Helsinki. It's a large new area for 25,000 new people and jobs called Hirranta. And it started in more real sense with all kind of temporary uses, even companies operating for a short time in industry space and so forth. And it has been now running very successfully for some years, about 3 years. And now there is a discussion, what next? So the city is really careful in not spoiling that process. But it's still not easy to find the what next. But at least there is a discussion ongoing on that.
Okay, I think we're going to have to round it up there. I mean, you touched on many of the issues we've also had previously in this urban lab, and they're very vital discussions and considerations. And Leah is pointing out, you might say, the danger or the result in many cases, what may happen, is that perhaps the potential of these spaces and places and networks and activities is not really understood or can be managed by and become normalized in a way. This normalization of places. So I think that's the danger. There are, and it's basically also, I suppose, it's a question of when you say about the right to places, the right to be able to create, the right to be able to, you might say, have access to the city, and the right to also generate new activities and create, has a lot about ownership and has a lot about, you might say, political mandate, and has a lot about financing. But there are some places where it has happened and it has survived and somehow keeps going. And I don't know if because we have a couple of people here from, I just thought, would you like to say something? I'm not going to say who it is. I think you know who it is because I'm looking at you. But do you want to say something in this situation, or would you rather not? I don't want to hang you out and put you on an edge and push you into the deep end. I'm looking at you, yeah. Yeah. So do you want to come in here? Because I think this discussion actually is quite interesting from where you come from and where you've been. I mean, I'm thinking about Christiania, right? So because I just think that is actually, you know, it was interesting, as you are an architect and you work on issues like this, and you talk about how to create sustainable alternative, you might say, societies, which has existed now in for 45 years or whatever it is. And I think it's actually, at that time, you would call it a squat, or you'd call it a temporary space. But actually what it has developed into is something which is, you might say, managed to maintain its independence while being accepted. So it's actually managed to do that, which we don't think is possible. And why is that? Why did that happen? And why doesn't it happen any other place?
It happened because there was no other plans in the 72, and it happens because there was a strong feeling of communities And it happened because there was low rent or non-rent in the start, and low rent is very important. Is one of the things. So if you want to develop a city with this kind of life in, you have to have smaller places of low rent that can pull the development of the city in that direction you want. And of course you have to have people that burns for developments, and you have to take them seriously. You have to, I understand the lady over there talking about having a greater plan for a city, but you have to, if you give power to some people, you have to take them seriously, that they want to use that power or use that energy, not to ask them for something and then take it back and then say it was a game. And then make other plans. Take them seriously. Make them a motor, engine. Make them an engine for what you want, and let them be there for some times. And it's very important that they don't that they don't own the houses, but they rent the houses. So they are changing, because otherwise they will be stable as the rest of the city.
Which is an interesting point. Is this thing about spaces which are unstable or destabilized on the edge and are always changing?
Yes.
So there is an inertia in them, which is interesting. There's no permanent owner who is like looking at it as a long-term investment or family or the right to forever. Marco, you come from Berlin, and you're practicing in Berlin, and you've been through this, experienced this a lot. I mean, how are the things we're talking about here? Can you reflect on, and has it given rise to, you might say, another way of urban thinking and urban practice, and a sense of other kind of communities which are more in control of their own, you might say, daily life, their own creativity, their own, yeah.
Well, I moved to Berlin in '91, and what was in front of me was a playground, a huge playground where we could actually use the whole city center of East Berlin, of course, especially Berlin Mitte. And the funny thing was that nobody knew how long we could use one space. And this gave us a huge freedom of not considering time as something obsessive to us. It was, like it was. Sometimes it lasted one day, some other times a couple of years. But those were the rules which were unwritten. This was a result of this vacuum we had in this specific historical period due to the collapse of one state and the time that the new state, the Federal Republic, needed to control the city. It was a time of anarchy that defined our childhood. Some kind of experience like this are still running, of course. There is a big process of normalization. But Panu, you quoted Berlin many times. And still Berlin is, it gave us some suggestions about how to deal with temporary space.
You want to say one last word? Okay, let's tie it up there. And now we're not going to even give you 2 minutes break. We're going to give you 1 minute break.